Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a round 5 game from the 2015 Sinquefield Cup between Veselin Topalov playing on the white end and Fabiano Caruana. Let's have a look. E4, E5. Ruy Lopez on board with move 4, D3. So in this Ruy Lopez, the E4 pawn will live. No castles, knight takes E stuff. Here comes the king bishop. Watch out for this central pawn break. It's being prepped for when or if it happens. It will be with tempo. Both kings now safe. Queen bishop ready to come out. E5 is reinforced. Knights are connected, and a little bit of repositioning. Knight E7. A little bit of a mysterious move. Not to the players. Up until this point, they've spent little to no time. Well within their preparation. For the next several moves, they will spend little to no time. Just to give a little bit of insight here, knight e7, moving a piece that is already developed. Again, at this early stage, why not, let's say, bishop g4, inviting a new piece to the party, as Yasar Seirawan would say? What's the story behind it? Well, for one, it sidesteps any idea by white to invest the bishop pair and damage the black pawn structure. And on top of this, with some time, black can seek his own central pawn break with c6, knight g6, and then d5. This takes time. White, if he so chooses, can already break in the center, and does. d4 hits. And this is, well, to be expected. White, having the first move in a chess game, will often have that time edge. It's put to use right away. d4 hits, e5 can now not be maintained. Dropping the bishop back, white takes twice. So, e takes, and only then, bishop b6. So how are things looking here? Pretty good, if we look at the pawn center for white. Controls a lot of squares, some nice options. Any downside? Sure, the knight on d2, not such a happy piece. Much rather morph into a bishop for just a move. c3 is better, freeing the way for the bishop. But okay, nothing so serious here, nothing that cannot be fixed. Okay. Rook e1. It's also worth mentioning that this pawn center needs to be challenged. Can't just allow white to have it sit there and have, keep black guessing. Is it going to be d5 or e5, or black needs to make it flinch, change in some way. Black seeks clarity, in short, with the white pawn center. So how do you do this? There are indirect means to put pressure on the white center. There are direct means. In the game, we see both. This is the first moment where black can do something about the white center, and does, by indirect means. Bishop g4. Exerting pressure on the knight on f3, who is a defender of d4. Bishop takes d is now a threat. White sees this and says, I want to get out of the pin. Black says no. You have to work a little bit harder. And white finally just gets out of the diagonal. The knight is now free. d4 is reinforced. Okay, the alternative of g4, that's another way, but it's super weakening. So it's queen b3, develops a piece off of the diagonal now. d5 hits, directly confronting this pawn duo, challenging the pawn duo with one of black's pawns. e5, knight d7. It's important to take stock of the position of the bishop on h5 and the role that it plays. It's true that the knight on f3 is no longer in a pin. But the bishop on h5 doesn't need to be pinning the knight to the queen in order to be a pest. For as long as he maintains pressure on the knight on f3, he's placing a certain restriction on the white pieces. The queen? The queen's not there. The queen, or the knight, in this case the knight, will have the responsibility to watch over the knight on f3. The pawn on g2 does not want to capture. The white king would scream. Need to keep the structure intact on the king side. So there's a certain restriction, my point, there's a certain restriction that the bishop still has on the white side due to the pressure on f3. Now, that said, you may want to backtrack slightly at this moment here. Instead of rook to e1, if this bishop is going to be such a pest, why not play the move h3 and use the following reasoning? I'm stopping the pin, and more long term it's a flight square. Seems perfectly reasonable. Well, why not here? You can expect the following if h3 is played instead of rook e1. d5, and on e5, guess where this knight's going? d7 or e8? None of the above. He's moving forward. e4 in the white position. If you thought a bishop on h5 was annoying, how about a knight on e4? Let's go one step further. What's more annoying than a knight in the white position? It's a knight in the white position that cannot be easily kicked, removed. He's going nowhere anytime fast. Knight takes knight, white would be crazy. Pawn takes, he has to find a new home, and the d pawn is gone. My point here is that it will be either the bishop or the knight that is annoying to the white position. What does rook to e1 do that h3 does not do? Watches over e4. White is already anticipating d5, and he wants to be able to play e5 and not deal with the knight arriving on e4. On d5, e5, knight e4, we simply win a pawn. The knight is gone. Okay, so rook e1 is played, aimed at controlling the knight. Bishop g4, queen b3, d5, e5, where is he going? Backwards now. a4, a5, secures this bishop position. a4 also weakens b4. Queen to d1, mysterious. Something, I don't know, weird, odd, one of those terms pretty much came to mind when I first saw the move. Couldn't make sense of it. Had to do a little bit of backtracking. More specifically, what I did is I went back. In order to try and make sense of this move, I went back and looked at the position when the queen was on d1. I mean, you went to b3, or at least I thought you went to b3 to get out of this pin. A few moves happen, and now you're going back home, working yourself into a pin again? Weird. Well, what's the difference? What are some similarities? What are some differences? Well, let's look at this position right here. Queen's still on her home square. She's never moved. What's the position like here? Okay, just get a rough idea. A few moves later, what's changing with these moves? Okay, now she comes back. What has changed from position type A and then B? Well, the structure in the center. At this moment right here, it is volatile. Could change in many different ways. And after these few moves, there's now a bit more clarity. There's a static feature to the center. There are fixed pawns in the center. The D pawns have no movement. Queen returns now, so it's the center that has changed. That's where the focus should be. Well, what has changed exactly? Well, e5 and d5 was played. This pawn is no longer, what is it doing? It's controlling these squares. What is it no longer doing? It's no longer controlling c5. So, the queen, we can say, is moving off of the b3 square, so that knight b3 is available to make use of then the c5 square. So that's maybe a little bit more helpful to us. But another question is still, well, you could move the queen to other squares and have the square available, so why d1 of all squares? Why go into this pin? I can't cover every square for the queen, but let me just highlight one. This seems like a perfectly reasonable one. Queen c3. It's not, on the surface, it doesn't seem like an issue at all. Stays out of a pin. Watches over the knight from the side. Knight b3 is available still. Well, what can happen is c6, and after the bishop runs away, maybe c5 is something that isn't so pleasant. Striking at this fixed pawn on black's terms, the c file can open up. And for when or if it does, the queen can be hit. A valuable tempo might be gained against the queen. She also, by playing to d1, she also wants to watch over the d4 pawn. For when the knight moves, she'll be watching over that directly. Black, with his next few moves, will be organizing his minor pieces in a way where d4 will have some pressure placed against it. Right now it's with the bishop. A knight will help out soon, putting pressure on d4. These other squares, c2, okay, there's bishop g6, so it's tough to find a good square. In general, I just spoke of a couple specific squares here, c3, c2. With regard to these third-rank squares, may or may not have heard this before, but if all minor pieces still on the board, these third-rank squares for a queen, which quite often isn't so comfortable on the third-rank squares. In many cases, even second-rank squares can, she maybe doesn't have a good home on second-rank squares. Just something to keep in mind. All minor pieces on board, queen on the third rank, maybe not so comfortable as she would be one rank back. Not until more of the smoke has cleared in the position, not until it has simplified a bit more. Anyhow, queen d1, a little bit of repositioning going on next. Where's this knight heading? For this now weakened b4 square. c6, b4 incoming. So let's get some more moves. We got a bishop out. h6 is played. Let me note one more thing. Queen here. This is not a possibility because white can break the pin and then take the bishop. So, okay, a little maneuvering. Bishop g5, h6. You still can't try and win a pawn at this stage, even though black has now two pieces hitting here. Taking the knight and then taking twice here isn't good because of queen g4. Bishop's hit, and look out, here comes bishop f6 going right for the king's throat. So, h6, white, similar to what black did when challenged with the h-pawn, simply backs up, keeps black in a pin. Queen c8, out of the pin. Normally you'd like to step up, but you'd be in another pin. So queen c8. And, well, with g4, white has had enough and says, I'm done being in a pin. I don't want to be restricted. I don't want to have my queen restricted like that. So I'm going to weaken my king position, free up my pieces a little bit. Bishop g6. Half open file now for white. And bishop h7. Not entirely sure of the meaning behind this. I can just point out, okay, this is a new possibility, okay. A tempo against the bishop. g5, a timely g5, I'm not saying right now. At some point, this can be an idea, a g4 advance to clamp down on f4. f4, after all, is a weakened square. It's a hole in the white position. It may also, in some sense, be a bit of a waiting move. Let's see what white comes up with next. It's useful. It's a little bit of a tucking away type move. Given some time, if white can have several moves in a row, all of a sudden he'd like to get this f-pawn rolling. You may reason that it's getting out of the way of more long-term. This is probably going a bit too far-fetched, but it's staying out of the way of an eventual tempo with the f-pawn. Let's see what white does first and foremost. Bishop g4. Computer isn't so big a fan of it. It likes queen to d2, developing the queen. Keeping pressure on this knight would mean that knight b4 cannot be played right away. As happened. Bishop g3, knight b4 is now allowed. No more pressure on the knight. But white may have had some idea of getting out of this knight-type move, gaining a tempo against the bishop. I can't be completely certain. There may have even been something related to an e-pawn push and having some pressure against c7. Again, I'm a little bit fuzzy, if I'm being perfectly honest, about those details. I, in short, cannot be certain. Bishop g3 was played, knight b4, and now rook to e3. This looks to cover some sensitive squares. d3. There is now, with the knight on b4 and the bishop on h7, some nice coordination here of both c2 and d3. Additionally, this rook lift is allowing the knight on c3 to reposition to e1, which frees up the f-pawn to move and would basically negate the knight on b4. So this sort of thing, knight on e1, canceling out these two squares, offsetting minor pieces is how I like to look at it. Okay, knight a2, rook a1, knight back to b4. We kind of glance over at the clock and wonder, is maybe Caruana content with a draw in this position? You know, would that actually happen if white played back to c1? Would he play this? Maybe. I can't be certain, you know. But, you know, looking at the clock, there is a pretty significant time edge here for white. Maybe black would be fine with a draw. If, you know, looking at the time, looking at it from the perspective that black is, you know, quite often content with having a draw. But Topalov is shooting for more, clearly, with his next move, knight e1. Just covers these squares. Okay. Knight c6. So this is a nice reorganization, good coordination for the minor pieces. Black's minor pieces exert some pressure against d4. A knight on b4 will not be kicked. This is a wonderful home. Queen d2. Both sides improve their queen. And now bishop takes knight. This is a very interesting moment, especially when Topalov is giving up his bishop for a knight. Quite fond a player of the bishop pair, quite fond of the bishop pair, and to give up the bishop like this, there must be some good reason he has behind it. Earlier in the tournament, he played a game where he gave up a pawn just to obtain the bishop pair against Nakamura and converted it very nicely. So he's now giving up the bishop for what exactly in this case? He's given up the light square bishop, and I believe the main intention behind this is one related to time. He wants to make use of the one trump he has. I believe it's the one trump he has, which is to say this space advantage, the pawn on e5. He's trying to work with this pawn, getting, let's say, something going on the king side where he has a space advantage. What needs to happen before he can focus on the king side of the board is these squares here. Before, let's say, he can get the knight on e1 contributing to functioning on the king side of the board, whether it be knight g2 or f4, knight f3, he needs to have these c2, the c2 and d3 squares covered. Taking the knight and then playing to c3 will watch over these squares. The rook will have that responsibility, and this will free up the knight. Now, can white not play to c3 just right now and maintain the bishop and then move forward with doing stuff on the king side? That's a perfectly reasonable follow-up. One of the problems that white can encounter is a quick strike by black against white's king side. Starting first with h5, looking to break down these light squares. Pawn takes here. This is just way too weakening. For one, you're dropping the h-pawn. This pawn is bound to fall. f5 is the main thing to recognize. The f5 square is given up. Without the g-pawn around, without g4 maintained, white can forget about some idea of launching this f-pawn up here. It will never have enough support. So h5 can happen is what I'm getting at. And after, let's say, a move bishop e2, maintaining this point, takes, we can now have f6. And this position of white's is really getting broken down. Look at the enormous pressure on the white center. And e5 is hit. How exactly to defend it? f4? Nope, that's not doing it. It seems like it's defending e5, but it's not. This pawn is now powerless. So you've added one defender and you've taken another away of the e5 square. Black can simply take twice. Bishop takes, queen takes. Again, we got this pin going on. So this is how things could follow up if, let's say, instead of first investing the bishop, white were to play rook here, keep the bishop on board. Black can be very quick to strike at the black can be very quick to strike at the white king position. Okay, so we had bishop takes knight, queen takes, rook c3, and now a repositioning of the knight. There isn't any tricky knight fork or anything. You know, if this knight is trying to get over here right away, there's knight to c2 ideas, or maybe even queen to c2. So it's first rook c3, knight g2, looking to dislodge this queen. There are, keep in mind, light square weaknesses. This is, we have a minor piece imbalance on board. One of the main focuses should be the unopposed. Where is the unopposed bishop? It's this guy here, the light square bishop. You want to make sure you keep him under control. This may quite possibly, this can be a very good square for the bishop. As it stands right now, it is not a hole for as long as the pawn remains on f2. Can always kick him away. Just something to be careful of. Your light squares are now super, super sensitive. The white side's light squares are very, very sensitive. f6 is played, and now knight to f4. If f4 is played, we can take, and after the recapture, a couple ideas. One is to go for a straight doubling, and another is to play g5. Very, very awkward for the knight. He needs to reposition. He's now a very awkward piece. In fact, both of these knights, not so well placed. And this bishop, I'm not sure what it's really doing besides staring at this pawn. So f4 really is not helpful here. The idea that white had is to get the knight into f4. Knight f4 on board, queen d7, and now e6 with tempo, and queen to e7. Might be a little bit curious about the queen's decision to play here instead of here. Just, playing here, if the pawn advances, at least it's not coming with tempo in this case. So why d7? Well, if you're playing here, one of the drawbacks might be that after rook e1, when the e file opens up, the queen would have to move again. So it's queen d7, e6, queen e7. Okay, so that was a pretty big shift there. We now have a passed pawn. He's defended with the knight, not a pawn, so you have to be a little bit careful here. This knight on f4 is not stable. There's always g5 in the mix, and maybe black scoops that pawn up. Not so fast. Rook e1, overprotecting this passed pawn. f5, black looks to break down at this weakened king position. This is a perfect home, h6 and g7 structure, whereas the f2, g4, h3, it's vulnerable. Many more weaknesses in the white camp. Black looks to break that down with f5. Black also looks to open up the f-file to get at these weakened f squares, f4, f3. Knight c5. He's taken out immediately. The rook is there to recapture. c6, solidifying the center, reinforcing d5. He's out of play, so he's repositioning, rook c3. And now g5. So big moment here. White has to be very careful. Where to go with the knight. It's a big moment. In the game, he went to g2, and what followed is f4. And this basically kills the bishop and the knight. When knight g2 is played, Topalov already has in the back of his mind that f4 is going to be played, and he's going to go for a piece sacrifice, capturing on f4. That's what happened in the game. An alternative is knight h5, but this still does not turn out so well for white. f4 would still happen, and after bishop to h2, there's bishop g6, getting rid of the knight, and soon thereafter this pawn could be rounded up. Short story here is that this particular pawn structure, f4, g5, and h6, killed the bishop on h2. He's not playing. So it's very difficult for white already at this moment here. Before it's even, at this point it is already difficult for white. So g5 is on board, knight g2. White goes in for a piece sack. Bishop takes. And this, as it turns out, is just not good for white. The piece sack, it just is not working. There was something better earlier that I'll touch on in a little bit, but let's just play through how this finished up. Giving up a minor piece, there's not enough compensation here. Have knight d3. This is finally hitting, winning some more material here, hitting the rook, hitting the bishop. It's hit now a second time. Rook takes knight, bishop takes. On queen takes bishop, it's just rook takes bishop, and black is up a full rook. White has some pawns, but they're nothing that they aren't pawns that they're pawns that are under control. Okay, so we didn't have queen takes bishop. Bishop takes h, and rook to f3. Nice move, defending the bishop, entering the white position. Nice square on f3 here. Rook e3. Rook takes, just simplifying a bit more. Queen to h7. f3, and there's other tries like queen to g5 check, queen g6, and then exchanging queens like this. But however you slice it, black is still up a rook and winning here. So you really can't trade queens like that. f3 is tried. Rook gets active. h4. Pawn pushes. Queen d6. Hitting this pawn, keeping pressure here, and there's ideas of queen g3. So bishop f4. Queen takes. Gives some material up, but black has calculated that the queens must come off, and at the end, black will pick up this f-pawn. What are the options here? You have to block with the queen. Moving with the king, we got rook e2, and you already have to give up your queen. So black has already calculated that by giving up this bishop, like this, we will get into a rook versus bishop ending where the f-pawn will fall. And soon the b-pawn, black basically calculated the rest out to its end. There isn't too much calculation. Probably just got to this point right here, recognizing if this pawn falls, these pawns and the bishop will not be enough to, black will be quicker to advance his pawns. So, in fact, I'm a little bit curious. I didn't look at the time, but I wonder right around this point. Queen to d6, yeah, just a few minutes of thought. He probably just calculated around this point where he knew he was going to win that f-pawn, and that was sufficient enough. Rook f8 is the key move. The bishop's hit, and when he's moving, When he moves, the f-pawn drops, and soon we have the queenside pawns now dropping. B-pawn is advancing, which means we now have a passed A-pawn who is very, very difficult to track down. And in fact, at this moment here, it's already, once we got here, white resigned after rook takes b5. This rook is in a position to sacrifice itself to stop these pawns over here. For example, if things were to play out and white was to march with first the g pawn, going with this pawn first, this creates light square weaknesses that black can quickly blockade. So let's start with the g pawn. Black simply pushes. Same story if h6, king there, so we'll start with this one. Black continues to push, and now after h6, one defensive move, rook b7, and he is there to sacrifice himself. Chop, chop, and this bishop cannot stop this pawn. Here, push, and you're just not in time. So, an interesting game. I think I usually say that with most games that I cover, but yeah, I found this game interesting, and to point out one position at least where there's a way to improve. It's one, not surprisingly, it's one related to the pawn structure. How we could have maybe entered a different pawn structure right around this moment here. This idea maybe still fine to give up the bishop for knight, but this moment right here, this move, what is it? Move 28, knight g2 was played. An alternative at this moment here was f4, which is looking for f5, grabbing some more space, looking to shut down the bishop. But black can still react well here. For one, there is a move, bishop e4, which is a little bit scary, allowing this pawn to even step foot on the black position and even go one step further. You don't have to go in that direction. I believe the move f4 would be met with f5, not even allowing this guy to move forward. And, you know, if you're capturing here, queen takes, this is the position we're working with where the knight can soon arrive on the e5 square. It's still a roughly equal position. Quite an interesting position. f5 right around the corner. This knight, maybe if f5 is played right here and the bishop is no longer playing, maybe the knight on b4 all of a sudden can be a bit misplaced. Even though it's a good square, he, in some cases, could maybe turn out to be a bit misplaced if there isn't this coordination with the bishop on c2 and d3. But anyhow, f4 it was an alternative instead of an immediate knight g2. We could have f4, f5, and maybe even at this point, so is it this move here? Okay, yeah, g5. If g5 is played and then h takes g, this is an interesting moment. You could go for a pawn sacrifice as white with knight f3, not even taking here. In fact, taking here would allow f4, just opening up the diagonal, opening up the file, another diagonal over here, and this would probably be too much. This is giving a pawn advantage for black in this variation. But after this capture, you could have knight f3, and if takes here, bishop takes, a knight now arriving on g5, the bishop no longer such a great piece with the pawn on f5, and again, this knight maybe, it's certainly a rare case, but a knight on b4, it is a good home, but with the action now shifting towards the king side, he could find himself quite possibly out of play if he isn't connected with the bishop here. I'm not saying this exact variation would occur with f4, f5, and then g5, but the main point is that f4, at least starting with this advance first, f4 may have been a way for white to improve. But anyhow, as usual, I found this interesting. Maybe you did as well. Feel free to leave any feedback in the comments section below to this video, and as usual, I hope you got something out of it. That's all for now. Take care.